Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the Fairhaven Lecture Series. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education. We have hosted the Fairhaven Lecture Series over at Fairhaven Senior Services in Whitewater since 1983. This semester, like everything else, we've gone virtual, and so here we are online today with you. Today we are going to talk about the election results, and we're happy to have back three presenters who've already talked for us this semester, but they're going to sort of go over the winners, losers, and what we can expect next. Their presentation is going to rely heavily on your questions as well, so please go ahead and put those in the chat box at any time. I'll sort of navigate those and read those out to the presenters as we go along here. Let me go ahead and introduce today's presenters. We have Dr. Jolly Emerey. She's an Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science Department at UW-Whitewater. She received her PhD from Emerey University in 2002, and her research interests include law and courts, state politics, and interest groups. We also have Dr. Susan Johnson, who is the Assistant Dean for Student Success in the UW-Whitewater College of Letters and Sciences, and she's the former chair of the Political Science Department. She earned her PhD at Northern Illinois University and has been at UW-Whitewater since 1997. And we also have Dr. Eric Loepp, who's an Assistant Professor of Political Science at UW-Whitewater. His PhD is from the University of Pittsburgh, and his research focuses on elections and voting, and he teaches classes on American government, political behavior, and research methods. And so I'll go ahead and welcome the three presenters, and note that your microphones are muted, so when you're ready to go, have at it. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I think I can go ahead and get us started. Thanks, Carrie, for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here this afternoon. And I think that what our intention is to cover several different things that I think are of interest to people who follow the election, and it was obviously an exciting time. And then, like Carrie mentioned, we probably want to take your questions as they come up, so feel free to type them in the chat, and Carrie will go ahead and ask those. And so we thought we would start by just thinking about the election in the fall, and kind of going over some of the general observations that each of us had regarding the fall campaign. And so I don't know, Eric, you want to get us started with some general comments?
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining us. I think the first thing to say is the caveat that there's still a lot we're waiting for, so things might change a little bit. But as far as kind of what we saw and what we experienced this fall, I'll talk just briefly about Wisconsin, which of course was something we all cared about very much, both because we're from here and because of its implications nationwide. And what really struck me in Wisconsin is that if you look at a map, it looks like Wisconsin changed dramatically, right? It went from red to blue. And of course, it did as far as the Electoral College vote goes. But when you dig into the data and look at how people in Wisconsin voted, in almost every county, things are pretty similar. Only two counties actually switched from one party to the other relative to 2016. So there's a lot of continuity. And I think one big question that political scientists are going to continue to wrestle with is, given that so much kind of stayed the same, a lot of places were very similar to last year, or last election, I should say. What does that tell us about the candidates? What does that tell us about campaign effects and things like that? And I think one of the biggest takeaways so far is that partisanship is a really, really big deal. People are very, very loyal to their parties in this country, and we saw both parties deliver pretty good numbers this year. In Wisconsin, for instance, the Democratic Party got more votes than it did in 2016, and so did the Republican Party. Donald Trump actually got more votes this time. So I think that tells us a lot about the fact that partisanship is still a really, really big part of our political life, and will very likely be a big part of it in the years to come.
Jolly, did you want to? Jolly, you're muted.
There, now I'm not. Okay, so now I'm not muted. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Yeah, I'm happy to speak, and thank you, Eric. I think it's great that you opened up with Wisconsin and talking about Wisconsin. It's sort of like, things have changed, but they've stayed the same. And this is, again, another very curious election, right? Presidential election for a variety of reasons. One of the things that I think I've been struck by, and this, we engage in this all the time as political scientists, is kind of this, Monday morning quarterbacking. And this, it's hard, right? It's really hard. And I think Eric hit on a very important point here when he said that partisanship is so important. I think in the past we've talked about how what's really important, because partisanship is so important, are those undeclared voters. But I don't know, and maybe Eric, or Susan, what that sliver of undeclared voters look like in this election. I think one of the things I've read, and I'm not sure how to react to this, and so perhaps the two of you would like to give comments, or people who are listening to us right now would like to give comments, but there have been some criticisms of the Biden campaign in that he focused too much on a referendum on Trump rather than really policies. And I don't know how to feel about that, given that, well, he's successful, but also, since things are so partisan, as Eric is pointing out, would it have mattered had he focused more on parties? I mean, would he have been able to get maybe a few of those other voters to vote if there hadn't been a real emphasis in the campaign on, a referendum on Trump? And in the end, I don't know how much it really matters, except maybe when we look to 2020, which I don't think Biden will be running in 2020. But it's just, one of the things that kind of stuck with me. And I had also seen, I paid attention to a lot of ads, and I think there were instances where Biden did, that the Biden-Harris campaign did pay attention to different policy issues, but this was a different campaign for a variety of reasons. And I think the pandemic, played a huge part in this. And so, I don't know, what are your thoughts, Susan and Eric? Or maybe I should just not even worry about this.
No, Jolly, that takes me back to when you remember Joe Biden's acceptance speech, and he was saying things like character is on the ballot, science is on the ballot, XYZ is on the ballot. You weren't hearing so much like the top marginal tax rate is on the ballot, right? Or this or that PPP loans are specifically on the ballot. One thing that I've been wrestling with the last couple of days, and some of my students have been weighing in too, is kind of this question of how much did the candidates matter this year? Because on the one hand, it was a very personal election. On the other hand, a lot of people would argue that Joe Biden was like the person for the moment. So I don't know, Susan, would you imagine that a different Democrat would have done either better or worse than Joe Biden this year?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question because if we consider the turnout, would the same number of people have come out to vote for, let's say, a Bernie Sanders, for example, or was, for whatever it's worth, the Trump campaign tried to paint Joe Biden as someone who was well to the left, although we know that he's not. And he's a fairly moderate Democrat if you want to compare him to Bernie Sanders, for example, or Elizabeth Warren. And so I think that was, to speak to Jolly's point, something that was helpful, I think, in getting that sliver, whatever that looked like, of independence to go that way. And so I like the way that Jolly referenced Monday morning quarterbacking, because we're all doing a bit of that, Monday afternoon quarterbacking right now, in fact. And I always like to wait a couple of months for people to actually start digging into the data more. And then we tend to learn every election cycle that some of our initial reactions or impulses didn't actually turn out to be the case. And so, but I think that what people were saying this weekend about Biden being the person for this time, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think I'll go ahead and jump in there and start with a couple of questions, if you guys don't mind. One question, kind of, you're talking about the two presidential candidates. We've seen some GOP and news outlets begin distancing themselves from some of Trump's recent tweets and comments. Assuming Biden is sworn in as the next president, do you see the GOP continue to use Trump's public appeal to lead the Republican Party, or will the GOP continue distancing themselves from him?
I can start on that. We're seeing some people in the GOP distance themselves. People like Senator Mitt Romney, for example, a few others, but we're not seeing as many as I would have expected to already have acknowledged the results of the election and, in fact, state that Joe Biden is, in fact, the president-elect. So I'm hearing the president still has not conceded. And I read today that he might announce he's running again in 2024. So if in fact, who would be surprised if as part of his concession, if we call it that, it would actually be an announcement of a 2024 campaign? And then, what does that mean for the Republican Party? So those are some of my initial thoughts to that question.
I think it's telling, Susan, that one of the first major Republicans to come say anything publicly was also the only one to vote for impeachment earlier this year. Remember that, everybody? Remember there was impeachment earlier this year? And I wonder how much it goes back to this idea that we've seen throughout the last 4 years, where the power of the president to break somebody's political career if they go against him publicly is such that there's a lot of individuals who may not actually question the results, but don't want to say something publicly that would get a flurry of tweets directed at them and potentially a primary challenger. I think that's going to be the really, really big, what's the right way of putting it? Like that's the thing I'm most curious about, is how much will a Trump tweet matter 2 years from now when somebody's thinking about running for Congress or whatnot. So I'm interpreting the lack of public comments along these lines as evidence that a lot of major Republican players still don't want to anger the president. They don't want him going after them online. So it seems that there's still a lot of potential ability to persuade and mobilize there, and just something for everyone to think about. And if any attendees have any thoughts, I'm curious too. Let's imagine that President Trump decided to run in 2024. Is there anybody that could beat him for the nomination? I struggle to think of somebody who could, if that's what he wanted. So I imagine that's going to be a big part of the next few years is President Trump continuing to play kingmaker or something along those lines, wielding influence, kind of an electoral or cultural veto power, if you will, even if there's no official law. I don't know. Does that sound about right to you, Jolly, or what do you make of this?
So, I can see that. I don't know what is wrong with me, but I want to hold on to this notion that I don't want to offend anyone. I want to hold on to this notion that at some point his power will dissipate. And so I think right now, absolutely, he's still president until January, right? And he does have influence, certainly, and he can do things. But I'm thinking as time moves on, so maybe it's 2 years from now, as you say, maybe it's hopefully sooner. I guess I'm showing my bias here, but I think that there are other people that probably want an opportunity, and they're just kind of waiting. And he's going to be 78, right, in 2024, 74 now. So, and we all know what he said about 78-year-olds running for the presidency. So, I think that I think that we may see some shift going on within the party. I do. He was able to mobilize a lot of people for them, so that would be a consideration. But I don't know. That's just my Jolliana or Pollyanna kind of perspective on things, my hopefulness on things. But yeah, we haven't seen a lot of other people speak out yet, but I still think it's early. I think it's early. And I think we may see, as the weeks go by, some people coming forward. Yeah.
So I think Eric may have mentioned social media or, tweets or that sort of thing. And so there was a question here in the chat, and a lot of people have joined. So let me just quickly say, those of you who joined a little bit late, we are taking your questions. Please put them in the chat box. And that's sort of how this lecture is going to function. So if you will put your questions in the chat box, and I will field them to our panelists. But kind of going back to how powerful a Trump tweet may be or that kind of thing, one question from the audience is that they've been hearing that some people from the conservative side are moving to using Parler for social media. What do you all see as the effects of a group moving to a unique or separate community, or the echo chamber effect and partisanship?
Oh, go ahead, Eric. All I was going to say was I've seen two people in my Facebook news feed say join me in Parler, but that's the extent of my knowledge of Parler, so I'm hoping someone else can help with this.
Well, I mean, I guess I kind of liken it to Fox News versus MSNBC. I mean, a lot of the media echo chambers, social media, cable media, all that, they kind of already exist, and even if you think of a media that is pretty widely used like Facebook, we all know that, the Facebook algorithm kind of programs you to see certain people and to try to get you to like certain things and open certain things. So the truth is we're pretty kind of self-segregated as it is. And in some of the commentary over the last 2 years about like criticisms of Twitter and who they block or what deplatform, whatever it is, I've heard some people say like, well, we should just go start our own social media. And part of me is like, yeah, go for it. I mean, like, why not? We do it in everything else, right? We have our own student organizations and our own cable networks. So I don't know what that would, how big of an effect that would have, just because we're pretty kind of self-isolated anyway in that respect, and speaking in echo chambers.
One of the things, thinking about social media, one of the things I've been interested in is how particularly Twitter has become so aggressive in labeling President Trump's tweets as not being factual, and others as well. And I'm just curious, there's a whole lot of people on the left right now who are applauding this quite vigorously. And I'm just curious how this is going to look for people on the left when it starts happening more so to people on the left. And because I'm guessing that this censorship, let's say by Twitter, is being quite well received now, but I don't know that it's going to maintain itself that way. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. I mean, I don't know that this Parler thing is going to end up being sustained, but I do think that the idea of social media platforms censoring speech, although it's not censorship in the truest sense of the legal definition, but just this idea of doing this and how that's going to play out and what that means for social media and its role in politics.
Now, one of the things that we often wrestle with, and you all may have in your courses as well, but I talk about things like, should Twitter follow First Amendment guidelines, like as best practice, because students might sometimes come in thinking they're subject to the First Amendment, which they're not, but should they kind of self-select and choose to follow a similar guideline? And I think if we see a proliferation of more kind of politically based social media, we might see more conversations about these sorts of things and what sorts of guidelines should govern social media. But if nothing else, I think it's good that we're all learning, that we're all getting a lesson about private versus public enterprise. And, Twitter can ban who they wish, and if they lose customers as a result, so be it. But it's an interesting conversation for sure.
So shifting gears a little bit, and this is actually going to lead into our next lecture next week. We'll know a little bit more about some of these things, but it has to do with kind of the transition and that sort of thing. The Office of the General Services Administration has not acknowledged that Biden is the presumptive winner of the election and therefore has not released the $10 million in funding for our transition team. Have there been delays like this in the past? And did you all foresee any issues this may create for Biden? May create as Biden begins developing domestic and foreign policies. In addition, another question along those lines was, if he doesn't have access to this transition resources soon, will they need to do things like pushing back the inauguration date or anything like that?
Well, the inauguration date it's set in the Constitution, so that cannot change. I think that President-elect Biden is probably one of the least people we would need to be worried about as far as transition goes, because he served as vice president for 8 years. And as I heard someone on cable TV this weekend say he certainly doesn't need a tour of the White House, So in that regard, I'm less worried about the transition, but it is an issue of concern because, as the person who asked the question indicated, there is a process that begins, and to get the transition moving. And we saw President-elect Biden yesterday, they released their transition website, and this morning he announced the COVID-19 coronavirus, his task force and things like that. And so, but yes, the official designation has not been given yet, and that means the money hasn't been freed up. It means the office space that comes along with the transition hasn't been started. And then also there are people in the administration who should be working on transition planning, and the President-elect Biden team should be meeting with those people and moving forward. And, that's not happening yet. And, we'll have to see how quickly things get moving or not.
I'm kind of curious how much a transition costs now. Like, how big of a deal is it not to have that $10 million? I'm not sure. But I think Susan is right that a lot of it is much more if the people who are currently in office are helpful and everything with taking meetings and luncheons and all that. One thing that I heard that was really kind of neat was when President Obama came into office, his team reported pretty universally that the George W. Bush team was incredibly gracious and helpful. And that's really important because a lot of things that don't make the cover of the newspaper that are happening, thousands of jobs or new people are coming in and that kind of thing. Having people know metaphorically where the Post-its are and all that kind of stuff is really, really important to kind of hand off that baton smoothly. So I don't know if the money is more important. I would guess not. But I'm also, and I don't know if either of you know this, I feel like this happened in 2002. Like 2000, TOO. Like, I feel like this money was held off from George W. Bush while they were doing the Florida thing. So I don't know if it's something to worry about yet.
It may have been, and I don't recall if it was held off or not. And it's good that you brought that up because, of course, that was another contentious election. It was my first teaching job. I was at the University of New Hampshire. I met with my students on Monday, and I told them, well, tomorrow we're all going to vote, and on Wednesday when I see you again, we'll have a new president-elect. And then, of course, I was wrong. I know it's not good coming out the gate and being wrong. The first time you're teaching American politics at a university. But yeah, I don't know. That is a really, really good question. Obviously, this is a different circumstance from what we had in 2000, but still, I'm sure there are plenty of political scientists out there right now putting together, all of the commonalities and differences between these two historic presidential elections.
I'd also like to encourage folks to join us on Monday at 3 o'clock, a week from today, where your colleague Louis Fucilla will be talking about presidential transitions. So I think we'll be able to learn a lot more about that from him on Monday. So please join us again on Monday. But let's shift gears again a little bit, and we've been talking primarily about the presidential election. Do you have any comments about, so that's sort of the biggest news, and there's still a lot of unknowns, but there are some big news stories in the Senate and the House. Would you like to share some comments on that?
Well, I guess we could start by saying, outside of the presidency, the Republicans had a pretty good election night. They gained seats in the House, not a majority, but they put a dent in the gap. It looks like they'll very likely hang on to the Senate. And a week ago, most of us would have guessed things going the other way. So, again, outside of the executive branch, I think Republicans are pretty happy. Obviously, the Senate will be very close. We don't know how close yet. But I think one thing that's really important for all of us to think about moving forward is to be very careful not to kind of dichotomize and assume all Democrats think this, all Democrats think that, because the Democrats that won seats last week in the Senate, like John Hickenlooper, they don't see the world exactly the same way as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So there's a lot of talk of like who can get to 51 seats in the Senate. And while partisanship is obviously very important, the median senator and the types of people who had a good week last week were mostly political moderates, right? Collins, Biden, Hickenlooper. So it'll be very interesting to see what this close of a breakdown in the Senate means. How easily will parties keep their coalitions together? I don't know, but I guess Susan and Jolly, let me put you on the spot. What are your thoughts about what we might expect to see in Georgia? Because those are two Senate seats that have special elections now in January, so we won't know the last two seats until 2021.
Jolly, you have a special knowledge of Georgia, so I would defer to you before I offer my own comments, and I'll let you speak to that.
So my special knowledge of Georgia is that I did live there for 5 years while I was in graduate school. I think that, am I calling it here? Is that my job right now to say the outcome, what I think is going to happen with these two seats?
I don't make predictions, so I don't ever expect others to make them either, but just some general comments if you have them.
Yeah, so, okay, so here's one thing I love about the South, and we're seeing this in Georgia, are that they do have these runoff elections, right? And so, and typically we see them more commonly in primaries than we do, in a general election, but still, I think this is fascinating. I don't make predictions anymore either. Obviously, I wasn't good at predicting that I'd know a president-elect back in 2000, right after an election, so that prognostication is not my strong suit. But I do think it's important to be mindful of Georgia's history, its history since, the late 60s and 70s, and that while I'm a bit surprised to see this happening, at the same time, I don't know that we'll see much of a shift. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's kind of amazing we're talking about Georgia at all.
Yes.
I mean, that's probably one of the biggest takeaways. And actually, that speaks to one of the other kind of, I think, really interesting things to take out of this whole election, which is Stacey Abrams and the idea of mobilizing people. Like we talk now, and I'm sure we all talk in our classes about the idea that, politics today isn't really about persuading a bunch of undecided, nonpartisan, independent type people. It's often who can you get to roll out of bed and show up on election day or wait in line or dodge rain or whatever. And Georgia may very well end up being a case study in how mobilization can happen. We'll see, but you got to give credit to the team down there that did a really, really good job. Just objectively, they were very successful in making a state competitive that I don't know if we've ever talked about Georgia this way.
Yeah, and the amount of money that's going to be spent by both parties in Georgia in the next 6-7 weeks is going to be amazing. The idea that there's 2 Senate seats that have come down to a runoff and the balance of power in the Senate I mean, it's going to be, for those of us that are feeling a little bit of, withdrawal, I have to say that after having watched CNN like pretty much nonstop on loop 24 hours a day, for the past week, I was feeling a little bit last night like, shouldn't I be watching something? And so, I mean, I think that now junkies like us can, focus on what's going on, not just at the federal level, because there's still stuff happening there with the presidential level, I should say, but also keeping an eye on what's going on in Georgia.
So coming back to Stacey Abrams, do you see a role for her in a Biden-Harris administration, or are there other names that are coming to the surface that you think will be in their cabinet or anything like that?
I don't tend to see Stacey Abrams as much of a cabinet person as more of a boots on the ground or somebody within the party. But as far as the cabinet goes, I mean, one thing that's really interesting and may or may not end up being really, really interesting is whether or not a Republican Senate, if we get one, is hostile towards at least some of Joe Biden's cabinet picks. There's been some mutterings that could happen. And if so, you wonder how strategic Joe Biden might be in, say, appointing some Republicans to a cabinet to kind of grease the skids for getting other people confirmed. You can imagine that a lot of people who were major players in the primary election last year who came over to Biden's team will be given strong consideration. I could, for instance, see someone like Andrew Yang somewhere in the Labor Department, maybe not running it, but doing some sort of, Office of Innovation. I've heard Elizabeth Warren's name batted around for Treasury. I don't know how difficult it would be to get that confirmation, but one thing that was really interesting to me is after the first presidential debate, when there was a talking about fracking, and Joe Biden came out and said that he's not going to put an end to fracking. Right after that debate, Bernie Sanders and AOC both publicly said like they're still behind Biden, and that says to me that there were some deals and some arrangements being made behind the scenes, because I'm sure they don't really find that fracking answer very satisfying. So it could be that there are some people who are in line to get some administrative pork, you might say, because they delivered on Joe Biden. I don't know. What do you all think for like Secretary of State, Defense, some of the really big ones? Any names jumping to either of you that would be kind of fitting with Joe Biden?
I heard someone suggest that perhaps former President Obama would make a nice Secretary of State. I don't see that necessarily happening, but Susan Rice is a name that comes to mind. If we think she held various positions in the Obama administration, and people might remember, she was down to one of the finalists for the vice presidential nomination. So I think that she has a future in a Biden administration at a high level. I read a headline that said that it's not a matter of if, but what cabinet position Pete Buttigieg will have. He was an early supporter of President-elect Biden after he dropped out, and he's been working tirelessly for him ever since. He's been a strong advocate, and he's been willing to go into so-called enemy territory on Fox News, I understand, and make the case for, at that time, candidate Biden. So I think that I would see him with the future there. But I think you bring up a really good point, Eric, in terms of who can be confirmed. And then also some of the senators you mentioned come from states that have Republican governors. And in a state where the governor gets to appoint a senator, if there's an opening, you wouldn't necessarily want to appoint someone who was a Democrat that then would be replaced with a Republican. So there's just so many considerations, right, that have to come into play. And I think that even more so, we've heard some mutterings from Mitch McConnell's team that it is not going to be an easy go for Biden to get certain people confirmed. I think on the flip side, though, he very well may, knowing President-elect Biden, appoint or nominate, I should say, a Republican. But the people on the left of the party are, I would see some heads explode I mean, there's so many things that have to be considered when all of this goes on, and it's going to be a very fine line that President-elect Biden, I keep wanting to say Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden is going to have to walk in all of this.
Dark horse nomination, Mitt Romney for Secretary of State. It's right out of the West Wing. Jolly, how about, this is one I'm really interested in, and I hope we can talk about courts separately a little bit later, but do you have any thoughts as far as like Justice Department or some of these agencies that have been in the news a lot, not always for the right reasons, perhaps? I mean, I think a big thing for Biden, right, is going to be kind of like smoothing things over and trying to reestablish public trust and all that. How do you see that happening on some of the kind of legal side of things?
So I think as far as an attorney general goes, off the top of my head, I can't think of someone that he would appoint, but I will say that he, has so much experience, having been the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee in the past. He's also got, Kamala Harris, who is an attorney and who, is probably familiar with some of the younger folk. He would know who the up-and-comers are that were part of the Department of Justice when he was vice president as well. So I don't know that that's going to be such a difficult pick for him. I do think that it's going to be another area, however, where he's going to have to be very careful and that the Senate is going to be paying very close attention to this. It's going to be interesting because if you all recall, when President Trump took office, one of the things that he did was he did a huge cleaning out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. So a lot of people who had been basically career U.S. attorneys who had gone in some instances from a Republican administration to weathering the storm with regard to administration shift, party shift in administrations, were able to keep their jobs. And here, when Trump came in, nope, he was cleaning everything out and putting people who were favorable to him, or at least people he thought were favorable based upon other information he was getting, into those positions. So that's the one thing that I'd be looking for too, not just, who will be Attorney General, but what's he going to do with respect to the U.S. Attorney's Office in general, and if he's going to do a bit of house cleaning as well. So, yeah, and of course, there's all these other court issues that are taking place right now. But so thank you for asking.
So you touched on this a little bit, but this is a question from the chat, and that is keeping in line with the Senate, assuming McConnell retains his position of majority leader, and should he revert back to an obstructionist point where he refuses to put bills on the floor and appointing judicial nominations, what would that mean for the country?
Okay, well, first of all, President Trump has not had any problem getting a lot of empty seats that were just sitting there on the federal bench because of Obama's inability to get his nominations confirmed. Trump has had no problem getting those seats filled. So, the entire federal judiciary, from the federal district court to the United States Supreme Court, those are life terms of good behavior. I think that, it could very well be what we saw under Obama with regard to any attempts to try and fill those seats. It's going to be, a slog to confirmation if things are like they were back when Obama was president, which, it was a problem for Obama. I don't know how much of a problem it's going to be for Biden because it's going to depend upon the availability on the bench. So, but I don't think that he's going to have an easy go of it if the Senate majority is Republican and McConnell is in charge.
Jolie, if the two Senate races in Georgia both broke for Democrats, which I really don't think it'll happen, but if it did, how much pressure do you think Joe Biden will be put on Joe Biden as far as like court expansion goes? And do you think there's anything to come of that? And then maybe even more broadly than that, is there wisdom in rethinking about the size of the court, or kind of where do you imagine the Supreme Court going after the last few years, or the federal bench more generally? But just, do we go back to normal, or are we in a new era where it's just muscling and powering through nominees 51 to 49?
Okay, so I think even if the 2 Senate seats in Georgia go Democrat, I think publicly, with regard to the court of public opinion, expanding the size of the Supreme Court is still going to be difficult. Thinking back to FDR and these attempts, I think what's the reason for doing that? There's one reason, right? And that is to get more Democrats or more liberals on the bench. And that I don't think that sits well with people, because people in general don't like to think about the ideology of justices and how they influence outcomes. I think if you're going to do something to change, and Congress obviously has the power to do that, but if you're going to do something to change things, I think, maybe toy with the idea of a constitutional amendment and dealing with the issue of term limits, right? Getting rid of that life term with good behavior might be a more palatable thing to do. People tend to like the idea of term limits, but I think that if Congress were to do this, if, let's say that did happen and Congress creates this larger Supreme Court, I think you'd be facing a backlash at the next congressional election, next House election. You'd face it at the Senate election, and the Senate seats are up, and you'd certainly face it at the next presidential election. I could be wrong. I don't know. I mean, people say this is all antiquated and it's ridiculous that we have the court stuck this size and been stuck at this size for so long. And this is Congress's call anyway, which is true. But I do think there would be a political cost to doing it, and I don't know that it's the smartest move, even if you don't like people who are on it or you don't like the majority of the Supreme Court. I don't know. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. One of the things that I've heard as an alternative would be the idea of increasing the number of lower federal court judges, and those, and I don't know the year you would, but those have not expanded in quite a long time, and there have been calls to do that, and that would be a way to make the bench wider, so to speak, or broader, so to speak, and then also if you can appoint more, let's say, appellate court judges, for example, you create more seats. That would be a way also for the Democrats to do something that wouldn't, in my mind, just like what you said, kind of blow things up by increasing the Supreme Court from 9 to 13, let's say. I don't see how that would play well for Democrats in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, they could potentially take advantage of the Ninth Circuit, right? Everybody's been talking for a long time about the size of the Ninth Circuit, that it's too big compared with the other circuits. It's unwieldy, and they've talked about splitting it up. So you could have this new Judiciary Act where you create I was going to say 10th Circuit. That's not right. So you create a new circuit, like a 14th Circuit or whatever, and that would allow you to then appoint more judges to this new circuit. You probably split some, obviously, from the ninth, but maybe have a few more seats on the appellate courts. And then you could, increase, the federal district courts are overworked. They are the workhorses of the federal court system, and they could use help. So you could create some more federal district court seats. And yeah, that's a good way, because that's honestly something that would be more palatable, that you can make a reasonable argument for. And the other thing about it, too, is that this is obviously one of the pools that you draw from for Supreme Court justices later. So, yeah.
So I just want to remind everyone in the audience that we still have about 15 minutes left or so, so please do feel free to share your questions in the chat box. And here is another question from the chat box. Some news stories have been showcasing the narrative that moderate Democrats feel that progressive, quote, socialist views cost them seats and or divided the Democratic base, which led to, as Dr. Loepp mentioned, Republicans having a good night. Do you feel that this was the case? What role do you see progressives playing compared to moderates when you consider party unity?
Yeah, the the big quote that jump-started that conversation was from Representative, I think, Spanberger. She said, if we are classifying Tuesday as a success from a congressional perspective, we will be bleeping torn apart in 2022. That's a Democrat who looks like she'll win a very close election. And she went on to say, we should never use the word socialism again. As far as what role they'll play, I mean, there are always factions within parties, right? 10 years ago, it was the Tea Party that started pulling the Republican Party more to the right in certain areas. Politics is often a numbers game. And so, there's a reason that Bernie Sanders hasn't got his vision despite however many years he's been in Congress, right? In many ways, the success that progressives have had on kind of putting their thumb on the scale with the party has been at the party conventions. And when you look at the party agendas for the last few cycles, Bernie Sanders in particular, while he'll almost certainly never be president, he has got the Democratic Party moving more in a direction on things like drugs and wages. So I don't think it's something where 3 or 4 progressive senators are going to be able to get whatever they want. But again, when you have such tiny majorities, the difference between getting 1 or 2 senators on one or the other side of a bill could be the difference between whether it happens or not. So I imagine that they'll continue to, be a veto point, continue to jumpstart conversations, but there are 100 senators, and none of them have a vote that's more powerful than anyone else. So I don't know, Jolly, Susan, what do you make? Are progressives taking over, as a lot of people on the right are kind of concerned that they're going to hijack Joe Biden, treat him as a puppet, that kind of thing? I don't really see it, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, I mean, I don't see it either. I think that earlier I made the comment that Biden was by no means, on the far left. He is comparing his agenda to President Obama's in 2008 and to Hillary Clinton's in 2016. He is more to the left. The agenda is more to the left, and that represents an evolution on his part. But I also think that it speaks to just how much power people like Bernie Sanders and others in his wing of the party were able to put on what the Democratic agenda became in 2020. And so we saw a commission that was created by President-elect Biden when he won the nomination, and it was kind of a 1-for-1. So they identified about 10 issues or so, climate change, education, criminal justice reform, and there was a Biden appointee and a Sanders appointee, and they came up together with the Democratic Party's platform. So I think that the progressives were heard, and their ideas are on the agenda. But I would also tend to agree with the representative that you refer to, who, you're right, she won a very close race in Virginia, that the term socialism is toxic. And so from a perspective of messaging, if nothing else, that's not something that I think we want to, the Democrats want to see becoming a tag that, I think that was one of the reasons why President-elect Biden was so successful. It was very difficult for President Trump to tag Biden a socialist. The tag doesn't fit. It just doesn't.
Part of me wonders, Jolly, in your heart, so Jolly and I have talked before about, part of me is sure that John Roberts did not vote for the Obamacare ruling in the way he necessarily believed, but because of institutional principles. And I'm wondering, Jolly, in his heart of hearts, do you think part of Joe Biden would be okay with a 51-49 Senate controlled by the Republicans that would release a lot of that potential progressive pressure from him on the left? He could just kind of say, sorry, it's McConnell, what can I do? Or do you think he'd rather have just absolutely as much as he could, and then they'll deal with the Bernies of the world when they deal with the Bernies?
I think that's an interesting question. I think it taps into sort of this comparison between Trump and Trump's ability actually to dominate the party so quickly, right? So he was able to really become in control, and part of that is because of the populist movement behind him, or, you know, a large part of that is because of the populist movement behind him. You know, thinking back to Biden and how confident, I guess is one thing I would say, how confident he will be in being able to push back. I think, frankly, I think it's always better to have more people of your party in Congress than fewer. You can still, you know, blame things on Mitch McConnell, especially if it's just, you know, a couple of seats or one seat that gives you a majority. It will be interesting to see how, when he assumes the mantle as president, how he interacts with the other institutions, including Congress. The other thing about him is, unlike Trump, he understands government. He knows where bodies are buried. He has, I think, some, I don't think people are afraid of him, but he has a certain, what do I want to say, gravitas with people because of his experience. And so, you know, it'll just be interesting to see how the party adapts to him, because the party, actually, honestly, I think the party needs him. You've got this president-elect that riding, you know, his coattails in the future is going to be important to you. So I do see that there are some voices that are very loud in the progressives or those who are further to the left, but at the same time, if they're smart, you know, they will maybe take a look at, you know, take the temperature of the room and say, okay, we've got it pretty good right now, so let's maintain this as much as we can. And so we may see them actually moving more to the center. I don't know. I could be totally wrong about this. So.
We have a couple questions about the election process and voting process. We'll start with this one. What, if any, changes do you see happening with the Electoral College? What kind of change would be needed should other states take an approach like Maine and Nebraska with split electoral votes?
Well, I'll start by admitting my bias. The congressional district popular vote model that Maine and Nebraska use, I love it. I think it's much fairer to the candidates. But I don't know that it'll happen anytime soon. And the Electoral College, like so many things, you have to ask yourself, who would benefit from changing it and who would not benefit from changing it? And do the people or the states that stand to benefit have the power to do so? And the truth is they really don't, right? Small states benefit from the current system. Battleground states benefit from the current system. And it would be really tricky, at least constitutionally, to re-engineer the Electoral College. That being said, I'm not sure who asked that question, but if you're not familiar, look up the National Popular Vote Compact, which is an agreement a number of states have made to pledge their Electoral College votes to the winner of the national popular vote. That law has not kicked in yet because not enough states have signed on, but a number of them have, including some big ones. Susan's home state is on that list. California is on that list. New York is on that list. There's some big states who are coming along, and there are still some legal questions, and if that law ever went into effect, I'm sure there'd be many court challenges. But you know, I think the fact that the popular vote aligned with the Electoral College this time is going to ease up some of the pressure to change that we saw in 2016. If we went 2-3 elections in a row where you had, 3 or 5 million vote differences and the person with the most lost, you might see more people come along. But I don't know. I don't really see it changing that much. How about you two?
Yeah, I don't either. I'm showing my age, but the first time I participated in the Fairhaven Lecture Series was in the 2000 presidential election. And I remember discussions about, will the Electoral College go away? And because of what happened there, and there were calls at that time, and I was skeptical then. And, there's been other instances over the course of the last, several elections where the popular vote winner has not won the Electoral College. And so I don't see anything happening. I agree with Eric. The only thing I could ever possibly see happening would be states going to the model of Nebraska and Maine. And the national popular vote thing, those are just lawsuits waiting to happen. So I know that a lot of people like that, and states have signed on to it, but I would have a hard time seeing it actually ever get implemented if it did pass. So that's what I think about that. Yeah.
There's one other X factor too, which is what happens if some of the reliably red states start going blue, like Texas. And if Texas were to switch to being more consistently blue, then at that point the Electoral College would no longer help Republicans. So I guess it's possible there could be some demographic pressure, but we're probably still a number of elections away from that being, a reliable thing. But I don't know. Jolly, do you think would a legal challenge to a national popular vote or some sort of challenge to the Electoral College, do you think the Electoral College as is would be upheld, or would the states get to decide vision prevail with the new Supreme Court, or what?
So I think that, I don't think that kind of law would stand a constitutional challenge, given that the Electoral College is constitutional. But, and I think that it's going to be really hard to get rid of the Electoral College. When I talk to students about it, and I don't talk as much with students about this as you do, Eric, because I don't teach 141 anymore. But, if you think about amending the Constitution, right, which is what you'd have to do, it's been amended 27 times, and the first 11 amendments came, in the late 1700s. So, and one of those other amendments repeals another amendment. So it's really a challenging process to do, and you've got to have enough, as you said before, Eric, you've got to have enough dissatisfaction with it in order to get it done. So I think that movement is making people feel better, right? It's something that you can at least say, I don't like this, and, there ought to be a law, except that there ought to be a law that's constitutional and effective. That's what I would say to that. So.
A question here on voting, and after this election, do you think there will be pressure to streamline the mail-in voting process so that everyone's on the same page?
So I think some would argue that it is pretty streamlined. There's 50 states in the District of Columbia, and they all have the right to design how they accept, their ballots and what kind of requirements they put on people. And I know that right now, particularly amongst a lot of Republicans, there's this desire to make things more streamlined, but streamlined in a way that I think meets their needs and goals. And I think that, Democrats would like to see it streamlined to meet their needs and their goals. I think I called out Republicans first because they're the ones who didn't win this time. And so I think there's going to be more clamoring on that side. But, states have the right to set these policies. And if people were paying close attention, this played out just like they said it was going to play out. And one more comment about streamlining is in states like Pennsylvania, where they were for the first time knowing they were going to get a lot of mail-in ballots, they asked the state legislature, which is controlled by Republicans, to change the law to allow for counting to begin earlier, and the Republicans in the legislature refused to do that. So the delay in Pennsylvania that we all suffered through was, it was avoidable. Had the Republicans in the legislature been willing to change the law to make it like other states, like, my home state of Illinois, where they could actually open and start counting those ballots early, and we would have known things differently. So, I guess those are some of my thoughts, but I don't see a lot of big changes, and there will not be national law that does this, because there would be no agreement on what that national law would look like.
And Joey and I spent a long time in Oregon, so we're kind of just like, where have you all been with the mail-in voting thing? But this is, I think, a really good time to really underscore something Susan just said, because you're hearing a lot of this in the news. Elections are one of those things that are incredibly state-oriented. I mean, the federal government has very little to do with it. So we're almost certainly not going to see something like that. Although you could imagine pushes for like national automatic voter registration or something to keep the issue alive. But this will probably continue to be very much a state-by-state thing.
So I think we're sort of at time, but I think there's one final question I'll go ahead and ask the panel. And I know, Susan, you said you typically prefer to have a couple months or more to digest and reflect results, but here's the question. In a world where facts were called fake news and lies called facts, from an academic standpoint, how do you see historians characterizing the past 4 years? Also knowing that none of you are historians, so you're speaking for colleagues on another floor in Laurentide.
Actually, same floor, but so I mean, I think that it will be seen as one where not a terribly whole lot got done as far as policy goes. I think it was chaotic. I think that a lot of norms were broken, some might say destroyed, and I'll be very curious to see if some of those norms get reestablished. I'll end up there and let my colleagues offer their comments because I know we're getting close to time.
I think that they'll also, hopefully, it's a blip, right? And so they'll be talking about it in terms of those factors that led to Trump getting elected. And then also we'll hear someone who has absolutely no experience, and boy, did it show. In terms of the lies, and we're hearing more lies now with regard to all of these lawsuits that are being filed about the election, it's propaganda, right? And it's something that you often see within certain populist movements, the use of propaganda to mobilize certain people who are supporting you. And so I don't think it would come as a huge surprise to an historian to look back at other periods when this has been successful. I think that the use of technology also, benefited with respect to this propaganda. And so that's where I'll stop right now.
Yeah, I agree with Susan and Jolly both. I think it'll be really big to see how much of this is a Trump effect versus a larger effect, right? And it could be something that those norms get rebuilt, or maybe it turns out they were just bent and not broken, and I'm hopeful for that too. And if I can end by plugging all of what we do a little bit more, I think the last few years have really underscored just how valuable it is for us to be a literate society, to understand, how do we check the claims of our political leaders? How do we know what a poll actually means? I know there's a couple of method students on this call who just did this with me a few hours ago. But there's a reason we care about it so much, and it's because if you want to make the normative decisions about how things ought to be, then you need to start with how things really are and not how you want them to be in your mind. So just a quick pitch for any undeclared students to come spend some time in poli-sci the next few years. It's going to be a really important time to build up that kind of political, cultural, literate infrastructure. And so come help us out.
Well, what a great place to end it. And I'll also just say, that lectures like this, where we get to share the expertise of our faculty, are so important. So thank you all for attending, and thank you to the three of you for sharing your expertise both today and throughout the series, and for being such good friends to the Fairhaven Lecture Series. Thank you all for joining us online, and I hope we're able to have in-person lectures again soon, and that you'll join us again for the future. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Carrie, for organizing. These go so smoothly with you at the helm.
Thank you.